Hello, it's Michael Watts here, and welcome to another episode of Life on the Fretboard, brought to you by the kind sponsorship of Elixir Strings. More about all that later on, but first of all, I'd like to thank so many of you who got in touch about the previous episode where my guest was the wonderful Adrian Utley of Portishead. It was very touching to hear how much Adrian's music has meant to us all over the years, and it really was a joy to share this conversation with you. Now, on to this month's episode, where my guest is a relatively recent discovery for me. Like many people, I first encountered her work online and was really impressed with her lyrical phrasing and beautiful touch. However, it was at the Rocky Mountain Archtop Festival in Arvada, Colorado in 2022 when I filmed a session with her on Bob Benedetto's contribution to the Blue Guitar Collection that I got to experience her extraordinary musicality firsthand. It left a lasting impression, and I have left a link to the resulting video in the description to this podcast. But first, let me introduce you. Canadian-born Jocelyn Gould is a JUNO award-winning guitarist, vocalist, composer and professor of jazz studies who performs at the highest international levels. Jocelyn is one of those musicians that I could listen to for hours. She's a force of nature too, touring constantly, and I was delighted to fly back from Norway in time to catch up with her in the days around her debut at one of London's top jazz venues in Soho. We started what was to become an epic 3-day hang in London, but then took a train to the picturesque market town of Froome at the end of the Mendiv Hills in Somerset. Now, after a wonderful afternoon with Nick and Dan of That Pedal Show, we took a walk through the cobble streets of Froome before enjoying a frankly sensational dinner at a French brasserie. Thank you very much, Mick, for that suggestion. And then we made our way back to our accommodation for the evening, which was a slightly eccentric pub/castle affair. Ideal conditions for recording an in-depth podcast interview. I'm sure that you'll agree about that. So we talk about Jocelyn's childhood fascination with the guitar, the challenge of learning to learn. Let that sink in for a moment. Learning to learn. Oh yes, and individuality in music, setting lofty goals and the almost telepathic levels of communication enjoyed by jazz musicians. And then, just like that, she was off to Barcelona to play another show with another band before returning to Winnipeg to launch her new YouTube podcast show. Like I said, it's absolutely non-stop. Oh, and by the way, Jocelyn is up for another JUNO award for her latest album, Sonic Bouquet. You really should check it out. It's wonderful. But for now, you join us for a moment's reminiscence about the cherry dessert we had just encountered.
Yeah. What was it again? What was it called?
It's called a clafoutis.
Clafoutis. What kind was it? It's supposed to be cherry?
Yeah. So there were cherries in there, and
apples for sure.
Apples and sultanas, I think, as well. And it was baked into this wonderful sort of thing, kind of like a pudding, kind of like I don't know. It was
like a bread pudding almost.
Yeah, almost, with about a litre of ice cream.
It was so good.
On the top.
It was great. A very excellent
it was
choice. I basically just took all that lady's recommendation.
Well, she knew exactly what she was talking about, didn't she?
She did.
There are times when it makes sense to get native help.
There are times to get help on French cuisine from the English.
Well, I think she was French.
Oh, okay. Well then.
So, welcome to Life on the Fretboard.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. You know the format.
Yes.
And it's basically a series of one-to-one conversations between me and an extraordinary person. And that, for me, is you. You live a life on the fretboard. You are a touring guitarist in the jazz realm, which is something that we will talk about in depth. However, this series is kind of about shared experiences regardless of genre. And my opening question is always, do you remember the first time you saw a guitar?
Both of my parents were guitar players from when I was very little, when I was born. So I don't remember the first time I saw a guitar, but I do remember very strongly my earliest memories of my life. My mom was playing her nylon string all the time. My dad was playing his electric less frequently, but on the weekends. So there were those two guitars around my house, and I saw them and heard them all through my youth.
Right. And when did you start playing?
So I wanted to start playing when I was young. I was still in daycare, so I probably would have been about 4 years old.
Right.
I wanted to play guitar. So my parents, I didn't get one. You know, I was way too little to play either of my parents' guitars. And my parents didn't buy me like a little miniature guitar. So my daycare teacher made me a guitar out of cardboard.
No way.
She like cut it out, and it had permanent marker strings, and I had stickers on it. And I took streamers, like the streamers that kids put up at birthday parties, and I made a strap and a cable. And I took a box and I copied my dad's Marshall amp onto it with a permanent marker. So I had my little rig when I was 4 years old, and I would carry it around the house. And my older brother and his friend, one day I was like rocking out on my cardboard guitar, and my very cool 8-year-old brother and his friend came in and thought it would be funny to smash it. They were like, you think you're a rock star, this is what rock stars do. And they jumped on my amp and they smashed the guitar over their heads. So I remember being devastated at that, but I thought my guitar career was over. So I hung it up at 4 years old.
Early stage, wow.
Yeah, I hung up my dreams at 4 years old, and I didn't revisit them till I was 13 years old. My older brother showed me how to play power chords.
Right.
And that was it for me.
That was it. So that was the key that unlocked the whole thing.
And I remember it was May 13th when I was 13 years old.
Really?
Yeah. I still remember every May 13th, I'm like, oh, it's my guitar anniversary.
How beautiful. So was it always jazz that attracted you? I mean, you're talking in terms of a little cardboard electric guitar and a Marshall amp. That's not necessarily what I'd associate with like Barney Kessel and Joe Pass.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's because that was just what I saw as a kid. That's what my dad had. He had this red Squire and a little crappy Marshall amp. But I didn't start listening to jazz until I was 20, so, I was very influenced by just the music around me. My dad loved rock and roll. He loved the Beatles and all those kind of songs from his youth, and my mom loved singer-songwriter type stuff. She would play lots of blues and kind of more singer-songwriter-y type songs. So that's kind of the music I grew up around.
Right.
Yeah.
And then as you got older, how did jazz start to make its impression on your life?
Well, I decided after starting guitar at 13, I continued to be self-taught for years, for about 7 years till I was 20. I completely taught myself. I didn't know any music theory. I didn't know what a key signature was. I didn't know what anything was. I just knew the shapes. When you see C, you play the shape. When you see G, you play this shape.
Right.
I always wanted to be, as a teenager, the fact that I was a guitarist, despite the fact that I never really did it outside of my bedroom, and it was very much my own kind of private thing for myself. It was a very important part of my identity as a person.
Right.
Even from being a teenager, it was like a lot of who I was. When I started learning, like I skipped a ton of high school to stay home and practice. It was so much more important to me that I practice than that I, go to class. And I just, as a teenager, I was an avid songwriter. So I did that a lot. I wrote hundreds and hundreds of songs as a kid that I still have on some hard drive somewhere. And when I had always wanted to learn. I had a desire. I wanted to know what I was doing, but I didn't know how to learn. And I got really into blues a little bit older. I was really into Joni Mitchell, and that kind of led me somehow into blues. I'm not even really quite sure how. I got into, B.B. King, T-Bone Walker, Albert King, and then moved into Grant Green and West Montgomery. And it's really not too far of a stretch, I don't think, musically. Just some more stuff. They're just doing some other stuff in addition. And that was how it sort of started for me. So I decided at the age of 20 to start studying the guitar. I found myself a teacher, and I auditioned for a program, and that was how it started.
This is fascinating. You said something there that I found really quite poignant. You didn't know how to learn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting as a concept. So it wasn't that you didn't know how to do it. You didn't know how to learn to do it. So would I be right in thinking that the fact that you were self-taught helped the process when you found yourself in a position of guiding others along their musical journey?
Absolutely. Because I didn't have a teacher for so long, I had to come up with my own methods of learning. And I think there's sort of learning is kind of multi-pronged. The first thing you have to do is decide what you want to learn. Mm-hmm. And the second thing you have to do is figure out how to learn it. And the third thing you have to do is learn it. So for me, and what I find the toughest with music is, a lot of people do find that they get stumped with the question of what do I want to learn? That's a big part of it. You have to know what you're trying to do. But the second one is how. And so that was never an issue for me. I've always known what I want to do. And sitting down and doing it, learning it once I knew what to do was never a problem. The big barrier for me always through learning music, because it's abstract and it's different for every person, the big wall to climb for me often is how do you learn it? I'm willing to put in the time. I don't always know what to do with that time.
Sure.
So for me, having to develop my own methods of how to learn, I've always been a very self-motivated learner, taking responsibility for my own learning. Ultimately, with music especially, no one can do it for you. No one can people can guide you and give you advice, but that's all it ever really is. You're the one who has to figure out, how am I going to get from A to B? You
have taught at pretty much the highest level possible as a professor of jazz studies. So I'm fascinated how that process of essentially handing down a musical language works, because jazz, as I understand it, it's almost an oral tradition. There is an accepted framework that allows you to communicate freely.
Yes, yeah. Music is oral. Trying to fit music into academia is like trying to fit a circle into a square. It doesn't quite fit. You can write about music all you want. It doesn't mean that you have gotten any further in, your ability to express yourself on your instrument. I do think that it has helped. Always having to come up with my own method. No one was ever handing me a method. So having to come up with your own formulas, it's like the equivalent of a mathematician. Rather than memorizing a formula, they, learn how to, I forget what the word is when they they come up with the formula through math, rather than just memorizing E equals MC squared. What does that mean? How did they get to it? How did they derive it? Yeah. So I think that is a really important way to approach learning music is through deriving your own methods. You can follow someone else's method all you want, but that might not work for you, you know. You're the only one that knows your brain, and you're the only one who has your unique set of musical goals. Music is highly individualized and differs from person to person, so no approach should be exactly the same because everyone's different.
It's been quite a large couple of days for you, Jocelyn, since you arrived here in the UK.
Yeah.
I was very happy to be able to fly back and catch your wonderful set at Pizza Express in Dean Street in Soho, which is one of the landmark venues for jazz here in London. I was particularly taken, as a fingerstyle guitarist, the jazz world is something, I hang out with jazz players, I love them, but it's not a language I speak. You know, they sort of, I don't know if they indulge or tolerate me hanging out with them, but I'm very grateful for any chance I get to spend amongst you guys. I was particularly taken by the fact that you were flying into a new country for the first time, and you were about to play 2 sets, so a good 3 hours on stage with a 4-piece band who you had never met before and never rehearsed with. And I saw this happen myself. You walked in through the door, you sat down with the band, went through the numbers and looked through, a couple of potentially tricky bits, and what I found was particularly telling, a couple of areas where you encouraged them to explore. And you were like, this bit you can get creative on, this bit you've got some space here. I found that was really generous right from the outset to give them a sense that their contribution was really appreciated. And then with no rehearsal, other than a sound check, you did play 3 hours non-stop, and somehow it worked.
Yeah, isn't it incredible? I would have looked at that, a decade ago and thought the same thing. It is very cool that jazz musicians practice. We learn tunes, we learn repertoire, but we practice broadly in a way that we are equipping ourselves to improvise, and we learn a common language. So when I hear someone go ba-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da, the response is on the upbeat. So that piece of language goes ba-da-da-da, 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 That's response. If I hear that, that's, so if I didn't know that, someone in the band would go ba-da-da-da, ba-da-da-da,
and there's just a pregnant pause.
Silence, right? And especially because I teach, I do hear that all the time. What equips us to be able to do that, what equips us to be able to play an entire concert without having played together before, is that we have learned a common language. So it's the same way the 4 of us could sit down and have a conversation in English because we all happen to know English. We all happen to know jazz language. It's the exact same thing. We can't have, I don't know Spanish, so I can't have a conversation in Spanish. I do know jazz, so I can have a conversation in jazz. It's the exact same thing. It really is a language that gets improvised in exactly the same way, the way I'm putting together a sentence right now, with the words that I know that are in my repertoire, with my licks.
Right.
I have words. I have vocabulary. You talk about jazz vocabulary. That's a common term. Your little pieces that you have learned, your little nuggets of language. I'm talking to you, I'm responding to what you said, I'm piecing it together, I'm saying something I'll never say again in the exact same way, but I will use all these words again at some point, probably pretty soon. Like, I'm not going to completely reinvent the wheel the next time I talk, because that wouldn't be English.
Right.
It's the same way you're not going to completely reinvent the wheel every time you play jazz, because it's a language, and so you have to use the language that you know. You don't have to, but that's what makes it familiar to other people.
Right.
It's like very cool to have come into this understanding, because it used to totally baffle me that musicians can do this. And so it's similar the way we've learned tunes. Like, that band had never seen those tunes before. I had sent out the charts, so they had checked them out a little, but when you learn tunes, the more tunes you learn, the more similarities there are between tunes, and it all kind of just becomes like a common knowledge. And the more you do, the easier it gets, and the more listening you do. Yeah, it's very exciting. It's very cool. It is very, very cool, and I think it's really a special art form, in that it is improvised, and it draws on all of our commonalities as musicians. All the records we've all checked out, like the pianist was playing things, and I knew where they were from, and I was able to know from how he plays what pianists he likes. I was able to know from how he plays, oh, he was quoting Hank Mobley there. He was, and I know that because we've listened to the same record. So it's super exciting. It's like a unifying thing, having listened to the same music history.
We've been hanging out for a couple of days now.
Yes.
When you got off the stage, you said to me, I'm pumped, I'm ready, let's do the podcast tonight.
I did say that.
And I thought, this is wonderful, but I've seen this before. and as much as I wanted to believe that it would be possible, I thought that the combination perhaps of jet lag, tiredness, and maybe the sheer adrenaline of coming off stage might lead to something of a spiral later on. Do you depend on adrenaline spikes?
Yes, I'm often very tired before gigs. I'm often kind of dragging, and there's just something about playing a gig, playing a concert, that brings me to life temporarily. Yeah, I just wake up. It's not that often that I don't wake up. Sometimes, every now and then, it can be a bit of a grind from start to finish. But usually, the adrenaline kicks in, and I wake right up, and everything comes to life. And then it stays after for a bit, and I'm like, let's go. And then it crashes, and then I go to sleep. That's usually the way things go.
As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, this episode is sponsored by Elixir Strings, which over the years have become an integral part of my own sound. But it's in my recordings of iconic instruments that they've really come into their own. I've been very fortunate to capture the voices of some extraordinary guitars, from early 20th century Martins and Gibsons to contemporary masterpieces by luthiers such as Ken Parker, Linda Manzer, Kim Walker, John Monteleone, Irvin Samogi, and many more. And I've heard firsthand what an astonishing difference these strings make. I'm proud to be an endorsing artist for Elixir Strings, and I love them, and I think you will too. So visit elixirstrings.com for more information about the whole range. There's a link in the description below, and thank you to Elixir Strings for making me sound as good as I possibly can all these years. In terms of instruments, obviously we do want to talk about the guitar itself without fetishizing it too overtly. I was really struck by the fact that you are entirely monogamous when it comes to your guitar.
Yes.
That's it. You have one instrument.
I have one instrument. I mean, for me, it makes sense because I'm playing one genre all the time. And my instrument, just the way I approach the guitar, learning the instrument is such a big part of my voice. Being able to, like, my knowledge, my intimacy with that particular instrument is a big part of my sound, of my voice as a musician. I mean, I imagine it's something similar to how, like, a violinist might feel, or anyone who has their instrument, I know it very well. I know what I can do on it. I know how it's going to sound when I do certain things. Hopefully it changes from day to day a little, but yeah, and I just don't want the complication of, I don't know, I have so much else to do. I'm happy just having one instrument. I've got enough that I can do on this, like, enough to work on just one instrument. I don't need to be running around with a bunch of them. I don't know.
So today, one of the highlights of your trip to England has been hanging out with Mick and Dan of That Pedal Show.
Yes.
Which is obviously an enormous YouTube monolith.
Yes.
It's two wonderful hosts of the show.
Yes.
And they deal in primarily electric guitars and, as the name suggests, a load of effects. Mm-hmm. And I saw you walk into that room with an acoustic archtop plugged into an amp, and held these two guys absolutely spellbound. It was really quite extraordinary, the breadth of dynamics and timbres that you were able to demonstrate throughout the course of your conversation. We all the three of us seemed to really love guitar, so it's easy when you're around people who love the instrument. Yeah, it was very, very, very fun to chat with them. It's kind of all a blur. I can't even really remember what happened. I was nervous too. But what a positive experience. They were so warm and so generous, and it was just a really, really wonderful afternoon. And that amp sounded so good. Yeah,
the sound.
Was, Joey Landreth's new 2-rock signature model, which I believe you were playing through before he's even tried it.
I don't know if he's played that exact amp.
I don't think he has.
I'm not sure. So that was very fun. That was very fun. It sounded really good in there. The sound in there was really, really good. So that's very comforting too. What a fun afternoon.
Let's talk a little bit about the guitar that you play.
Yes.
It is made by the Benedetto company.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you love about that instrument?
Well, I went from this instrument. So I've owned 2 archtops in my life. The first was an Eastman. And Eastmans are known for being really decent instrument for the price, which is very low. Right. So I bought it used from Elderly Instruments in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, which is like one of the a great guitar store. I bought it used in 2016. And that was my first archtop. I had it for 2.5 years. I moved to New York, and one day got an email from Jackson Evans, from Benedetto, and my former teacher Randy is also a Benedetto artist.
Right.
So Randy had been talking to Benedetto about me for a while, and so he was the connection between me and Benedetto. And Jackson reached out and said, "Would you like to play Benedetto?" And so I was like, yes, I would.
Yes, please, that'd be quite nice.
So I booked a flight the next week, like a few days later, and went down to Savannah, hung out, and the rest is history. And I just love this instrument so much. The instrument is never in the way. The problem is never the instrument. Like, it's so nice to be able to cut that out of the equation. And one really interesting thing is that I just find, one thing that I find interesting about when people are learning is that they tend to start on a crappy instrument, because you're not going to invest a bunch of money into an instrument that you don't even play yet.
That's the common logic, yes.
Problem is that it's really hard to play on crappy instruments. So I think a lot of people just get frustrated, and it's not due to their own lack of potential or their own lack of ability to learn. It's because they're playing on crappy instruments.
But they don't always know.
They don't always know. I used to teach little kids, and these 6-year-olds would come in with literally toy guitars, like bought at the toy store. And their parents just didn't know. People just don't know what to buy for their kids.
Well, every 6-year-old should have a Benedetto.
Yeah, right. And this is why I'm introducing my new line. No, I'm kidding. And when I got this Benedetto, it was kind of the first time in my life that it kind of all clicked for me. I was like, oh, this instrument is never going to be an obstacle. It's just an incredible instrument. Now I can work on my own abilities. Now I'm not trying to get a crappy instrument to sound better. Now I'm trying to learn how to make a great instrument sing.
It's an important distinction.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And if I do the right things, it will.
And you don't know that until you've experienced it on a great instrument. You know, one thing that I hear quite regularly is, I can't imagine how this guitar could be any better than the one that I currently own.
Right.
You know, I get that a lot in my YouTube comments. Like, you know, some $100,000 Somoji masterpiece. They're like, well, I can't imagine that being any better than my red label Yamaha, which is, still a nice guitar.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's literally, that is the issue. It's a lack of universal experience and a way to make that imagination a reality.
Yeah.
And that only happens with personal experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And until you're at the wheel of a truly great instrument, you can't prepare yourself for it. You can't write for a wonderful guitar until you have one in your hands, because the realities of it, they are unimaginable. You can't prepare yourself for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very, it opened a whole bunch of new doors for me. It's been an incredible, I've only had it for 4 years. It's been an incredible instrument to have. I was, very, very lucky to get it.
Well, one of the things that I noticed this afternoon when you were talking with Dan and Mick was the huge variety of timbres and colours that you were pulling out of the instrument, even though you were, lightly amplified. What really struck me was your demonstration of the difference that is made when you hold the guitar slightly at an angle away from your body and allow the back to resonate.
Yeah, yes, yeah. The physics of it is that the sound is going to bounce off the back of the guitar and come out. And archtops are acoustic instruments that are amplified, but they are acoustic instruments. And so the sound bounces off the back and comes out the front. And if you have the back of the guitar up against you, it dampens the sound and it can't bounce off as effectively. So it's like pretty incredible, actually, the difference.
Yeah.
It really is quite incredible. Yes. So there's just so many amazing little things to learn about archtops. It's all about sound. It's all about how you're playing it, how you're getting sound.
And that was fascinating to me because I've always believed in quality at source. You know, find the sound and capture it right where it's happening. You know, it's not about plugins, it's not about effects, it's getting it right there. And you were able to demonstrate exactly that kind of methodology.
For me, it is, and I think it's particularly because it is an archtop guitar, I think that's where it's different from solid bodies in that way. There are so many different just little things you can change that will change the sound of the instrument. It's really cool.
Oh, yeah.
It's either really cool or we're just really nerdy.
It can be both.
Okay, great. Excellent.
It can be both.
Great, perfect.
So this is your first time in London.
Yes.
But you tour heavily, I would say, all over the world.
Yes, yeah. Since February 2022, when things really kind of opened up, right after Omicron, I've basically been on the road since then with very little breaks. Yeah, it's been wild. I have been to a lot of places, played a lot of gigs. Yeah, it's been wonderful. So I'm coming up on 2 years now that I've been basically straight on the road.
Wow.
Yes.
And how do you maintain some sort of sense of homeostasis, of balance, when your surroundings are constantly shifting?
Well, I think one thing that's a little bit different about me is that I love the lack of homeostasis.
Oh, you don't even need it. Oh, wow.
I'm like, okay. I mean, look at us. We're in friggin' Frome right now. We're in a castle in Frome doing a podcast. Like, who needs balance? What a cool life to live. I think I've always been someone who's up for excitement.
Right.
And up for, apparently, my mom says ever since I could talk, I was just like always up for adventure, and I just wanted to go on adventures as a little kid and was just always up for anything. My mom says she would be like, do you want to? And before she even finished her sentence, I would be like, yes, let's go. And so I think that is quite a component of my personality. I don't sit still very well. I want to go experience things and see things. So I maintain balance by making sure I get downtime on the road. I stopped drinking in September 2022 and found that everything got way easier. I ran out of energy way less quickly. So that has been a big part. And I largely did stop drinking because life was getting too hard to manage with, I was a regular jazz musician. Jazz musicians drink a lot.
Right.
On average. But it was just getting too difficult to be doing early morning travel days and gigs and just being on top of things and so that's one thing that I have done to make this kind of mobile, very exciting life doable. And I don't know, there's just something in me. Sometimes I wish I were the kind of person who could be happy doing something normal, like living in a city. Maybe I would like teaching at a school full time, and that could just be fulfilling and great. But there's just something in me, for some reason, I have to do this. And
so lifestyle that a lot of people might find overwhelming, you actively thrive on. You need this.
I have to. And it's not that I don't find it exhausting. Sometimes I'm so tired. Sometimes it's not fun at all. But I'm still into it. You know, like, but then you plot me at home and 2 days later I'm like, okay, what's next? Where are we going? Like, so there's something in me. I don't know. It's not the easiest life. And even though I'm passionate about it, doesn't mean that it's easy for me.
But you don't strike me as someone who looks for easy.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I kind of look for hard.
Well, I don't mean that either. I don't mean that you've got some sort of impulse to throw yourself at the most difficult thing going. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you've never struck... Well, you know, we met for the first time about a year ago, and we've been in touch ever since. I never in our conversations have I had the slightest inkling that you were someone who's just keen to coast and, you know, whatever happens, happens. You're extremely proactive and very driven.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I don't know. I'm a very intrinsically motivated person. That's what makes me happy. What makes me happy is setting lofty goals and achieving them.
Right.
That's I think that's actually a big component of happiness overall for, is setting goals and achieving them. Having a sense of accomplishment, I think, is a big component of happiness for anybody. But for me, I just love it. And I'm creative. I love brainstorming. I love what can I do next? What song can I learn? Where can I go? Just all this, I don't know. It's just really fun to think of the possibilities and then try and make something cool happen.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, self-determination, and if you look at sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, that fulfillment that comes from a sense of self and a sense of progress and movement.
Yeah. And I wanted to, when I look back on my life, I wanted this my whole life. I just didn't know that I could have it.
Really?
Yes. I wanted to be a Spice Girl, so badly. I always wanted to be a touring musician, even before I even knew what that was. You know, I always, my whole life, absolutely. I wanted to do this. Yep. I just didn't know.
We've just come back from a spectacular dinner at...
Yes, we have.
French Brasserie. Thank you very much, Mick, of that pedal show, for doing us a solid and recommending that place. Oh, my life. One of the things that we were talking about, because you don't just arrange other people's work, you also write. And this is something that I do too, and we were comparing notes on the writing process. One thing that... I wanted to discuss was the fact that in my experience, the initial act of creation is a very personal thing that very often happens in solitude. To the casual observer, it might even appear to be something quite lonely. And then when you've got past the initial act of creation, the initial act of the writing process, you then take this thing that happened in solitude on a very personal basis and you somehow turn it into something universal that can be enjoyed by an audience. You share it with the world from that point on.
Yeah, yes. It's weird, isn't it? Yeah, that is what we do. Yep. Yeah, it's, I think, very cool to get to share what can do that other than artistic output, you know? Share that human side that people don't always get to see. I think it's very cool and necessary, and there are a lot of people who aren't writers. They're not composers, they're not musicians, they're not painters, and they need us to do that so that they can, I don't know. I don't really know what I'm saying. This is a little self-indulgent, actually, that sentence.
I don't think so at all.
They don't necessarily need us.
I think you should follow that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just the number of times, that I'll play a song that I wrote and somebody will say that they, it made them feel emotional.
Right.
It's important to me to have that in my life, other, art that I consume that makes me feel emotional. And so I think it's very cool to get to have the opportunity to try and make other people feel things.
That's very beautiful. Before we launch into the final question, is there anything in particular you'd like to talk about? Anything that you'd like to address?
I don't know. We've been talking we've been doing this podcast for 2 days.
Well, that's the danger. Because what normally happens is that I sit down with someone and I say, please, let's not, I love you and it's going to be great to talk, but please let's save this until the mics are hot.
Yeah.
And the hard drive is clicking. The joy of this past couple of days has been, from my point of view, has been in being present to see you do this, and just to be there as an observer. So that's also meant that, over quadruple espressos in the morning for you and chamomile tea for me.
Hey, you had an espresso at dinner.
I did, because otherwise this would have been not so much a podcast as a sort of ASMR experience of me lying fetal on the floor full of steak and prawns.
I didn't even think about the fact that you totally had an espresso. A double
espresso. It's not so much an indulgence as a necessity at that point, because I just would have been comatose.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful meal. They looked after us with typical Gallic enthusiasm. I've never been so thoroughly fed. That is one of the risks.
Yeah.
Of course, with what we've done is that we've had some fantastic conversations.
They'll just be ours.
And that's fine too.
Yeah.
I've said this many times, and in fact, let me see if I can do this live. So one of the things that I do often point out is that I don't use Patreon for this podcast, but I do use a tip jar system. And I have said in the past that I would be having these conversations anyway. I actively seek out extraordinary people such as yourself, and I like sitting down and talking to you because I find I learn a hell of a lot, and I absolutely love learning and knowledge and sharing. But it is the contributions via the tip jar, the link is below, that encourages me to put up the mics and press record and even press save at the end of it, and then start hacking away at this thing in the editing suite, which of course takes ages, and there's the hours of editing and the travel and all this sort of thing. So if, and only if, you are enjoying this episode of Life on the Fretboard as much as I am, and I hope you are too, Jocelyn.
Oh, I am.
Then please do contribute to support my work and this podcast. Thank you very much indeed.
You just slid that right in there. I didn't even know it was happening until it was over. Oh, that was very smooth advertisement. We were like, so podcast, I'm like, yeah, it was very good. Very pro.
Well, Jocelyn, thank you very much for your time, and in fact for this past couple of days. It's been absolutely magical hanging out with you. I've really enjoyed your company.
It has been so fun, and thank you for coming on my wacky journey.
Of course.
It really is like kind of, sometimes I'm a little curious how people see it from the outside, because it's a lot. It's a lot to do. It's a little intense. But yeah.
But you obviously welcome that.
Yeah.
So, Jocelyn Gould, you live a life on the fretboard. What does that mean to you?
I guess a few things come to mind. You know, being a musician and being a jazz musician is a lifestyle that is unique. And I think it kind of almost chooses people, like
a vocation.
Yeah, but I think it's a bit of a calling. I think it's like, I don't really know very many jazz musicians that have chosen to be jazz musicians. It's chosen them.
That's rather like the thug life in that regard.
Sure, why not? Yeah, so I guess the idea of living life on the fretboard, it sort of makes me think of a lifestyle. What
does it contribute to your identity, to your sense of self?
Sure, yeah. Without being a musician, I don't know what I would be. I don't even know really how I would describe myself. So absolutely, it's a big part of my identity. I think it's kind of about perseverance, and yeah, perseverance kind of sticks out to me because the fretboard is such a freaking annoying, it's so it's hard to learn. You know, I've only really scratched the surface as a musician.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Michael.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you to you for listening. Tune in next time when my guest will be the phenomenal South African talent, Derek Gripper. It's a great episode and I look forward to sharing it with you. Life on the Fretboard is a Michael Watts production for Fretboard Journal. This episode was brought to you by Elixir Strings and I'm very grateful for their kind support. The theme music, Life on the Fretboard, features Mr. Dan Weston on drums and me on everything else, and the artwork was done by Michael Johnson. Thank you once again for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay tuned.